Good morning, Rabbi.
Good morning. Good morning. Uh, glad to have people online. We have here Mark and Betty and Richard. So here at the synagogue. So glad to have you, regardless of location, as always. Um, uh, so I've I just I did what I often do when I start these sessions in which I log into YouTube and then I write down like a title, or at least a sort of a title, a temporary title for this. And you're going to look at this title and and you might say to yourself, "Oh boy, here we go," because the title is divorce and sickness. And you know, we've been talking a lot. So we've been doing the last number of weeks, we've been talking about life cycle. And we've talked a lot about some real celebrations. Whether we're talking about birth, b'nai mitzvah, marriage. And so I want to acknowledge and maybe uh, uh, sort of apologize that that this subject may be a little more difficult. There will be at least a session or two about death and mourning. So we are getting to some of the more difficult topics, but I just want to make sure you're aware, obviously, because the life cycle has within it happy and sad, bitter and sweet, as Ecclesiastes would put it, a time to be born, a time to die. There is really a time for everything. So we're going to talk about that. I do want to ask before we jump in whether anybody has any leftover questions about weddings or marriage. Anything from last week that perhaps I may have left on the table or anything like that.
When how does Judaism, not necessarily Heskamuna, but how does Judaism in general look at a person who's married out of the religion and did not have a Jewish wedding as such, whether they had a wedding at the Justice of Peace, or like in my case, I had a minister was the official.
Mhm.
So my uncle did a little bit of the rabbi stuff. How does Judaism as a whole look at that?
Well, I think just on a person to person basis, there is a recognition that you're married. I mean that the marriage took place, and the marriage was certainly recognized by a civil authority. And one of the things that I don't know whether I mentioned it last time or a previous time, there is a Jewish principle to the idea that the law of the land is the law. In other words, we as Jews are not going to say that, oh, United States law or the law wherever we're living is not valid. So whereas it's not considered a Jewish marriage, uh, in terms of the way we consider the individuals, treat the individuals, you're married. I mean that's the that's an important thing. And again, this kind of goes along with the principle that we have definitely embraced recently, which is that we're not going to look at people who in interfaith marriages as we're not going to look at the couple or the spouse who is not Jewish as if they don't exist, right? I mean, that's not appropriate. That's not I mean, we want people to know that everybody's welcome in our community, right? So and I say that, I mean, obviously, that should be obvious, right? I mean, that should be absolutely obvious and ironclad. However, uh, there was a time where that wasn't necessarily the case. I mean, I want to note that there was a practice by some people that was absolutely extreme and not anything that I would have endorsed even when it was happening, which is that there were some Jewish parents where if their child married somebody who wasn't Jewish, those parents would sit shiva for for their child who had married outside the faith. That they were literally saying they are dead to us, and that practice was and is, if it still happens, offensive. In my point of view, you can be disappointed, you can be sad, whatever it is, but to just cut people off, that's certainly not what I'm about. That's certainly not what I think, what the Judaism I practice is about. That's not what I think our community is about. Um, again, I do feel that certainly in conservative synagogues and congregations, we've come a long way from that, as we should. Other wedding or marriage questions at the moment? So, in the spirit of being, of bittersweetness and what have you, we do need to at least acknowledge um, rules having to do with divorce. Um, and I do feel that the some of the rules having to do with divorce indicate a um, uh, ingrained sense of respect and dignity that do exist within Judaism. Um, I also should say that the foundations of the rules having to do with divorce were formed in a very patriarchal way. And so that is something that we have to grapple with, not necessarily adhere to in all ways, but certainly have to acknowledge, at least in its formation. Um, if you look in the Torah, there was an assumption, there was an understanding that a man could have more than one wife, and an understanding that a woman could not have more than one husband at any given time. Um, so, and the onus of divorce, according to the Torah, falls directly on the man. In other words, if the man wishes to no longer be married to a woman, he has to do X, Y, and Z. There is no parallel statement if a woman no longer wants to be married to her husband. Um, it leads us, and I think I did mention this last week when we were talking about the Lieberman clause in the ketubah, in the Jewish wedding contract, that um, there are thankfully, some provisions that the conservative movement has embraced in recent years that would make it possible for a woman to end their marriage in a Jewishly valid way, in which the man may not participate uh, at all. There are methods for that. But look, the hope is that if a divorce must happen, it should be with both persons' agreement. I mean, that is obviously the ideal. Um, so, in terms of the responsibility that we have, a lot of you know this about me. I am a divorcee. My wife and I divorced. My ex-wife and I divorced a little more than 10 years ago. I kind of counted from the time of um, when we separated. And in terms of when the Jewish divorce takes place, the idea is that we don't we don't have to deal with that. We don't have to deal with a Jewish divorce until the civil divorce has been finalized. Once the civil divorce has been finalized, it is important, it is vital for the Jewish divorce to take place as soon as reasonably possible. So my divorce was finalized, according to the state of South Carolina, in December of 2017. Less than 2 months later, my ex-wife was delivered a Jewish bill of divorce, which is known as a get, G-E-T. Um, Now, what goes into a get? The key for a get is to ensure proper record keeping. That might sound very technical and kind of heartless, if you will, but the because marriage is considered obviously a good thing, ideally, right? And the hope is that if somebody gets divorced, the hope in our tradition is that at some point there's an opportunity for remarriage. But in order for remarriage to take place, we have to make absolutely 100% sure that the divorce was official. And so you have a specially trained person, usually a rabbi, although it's not any rabbi who can do this. I'm not able to do this. To be somebody who can be what's called a misader gitin, which is literally the person who puts the get in order. In other words, an official about this. And much like a Torah scroll, which is written with a quill and special ink on parchment, so too is a bill of divorce. So too is a get. So what happens is, I'll say what happened in my particular case. My divorce became final, as I mentioned. I contacted a Mesader Gitin, somebody that I knew personally, I knew him in rabbinical school. He was a few years older than I, and I knew that he'd trained to be a Mesader Gitin. And so he said, okay, well, we need some information in order for this to take place. And the and essentially what we're looking for is identity, meaning, and most importantly, names. So for instance, if my name were, let's say, John, but I was known by different people as Johnny, Jack, uh, Spike, I don't know. I mean, whatever nicknames I would be commonly known as. The Mesader Gitin has to write down all possible monikers into the get, which can be kind of funny sometimes, to be honest. I mean, if you have some kind of a goofy nickname or something like that, but you have to put all that in because, again, the key is identity. The key is to make sure it's like, it's like, all right, if I were known as, Bubba or something like that, but my official name was John Smith, it has to be John Smith, sometimes known as Bubba. Like it has to be like clear which John Smith we're talking about. And the same thing for for a woman. So if the woman's name is Jennifer, but she's known as Jenny, Jen, whatever, right? You have to, if those are common ways of people referring to that person, you have to put all that in. Um, you also have to put in location, right? Um, yeah, Brittany, that would be an interesting. That would be a fun nickname. Yeah, Brittany has acknowledged that her. I mean, I hope it's okay for me to mention this because you sent this to the group chat. I hope it's okay. But it's that that if you know if she had to have one, her nickname is Wheezy. So yeah, it'd have to be you'd have to write that down. Hopefully, hopefully it doesn't happen, but yeah.
So if you had, say, a nickname in high school, but it's not used anymore, does that still need to go into the get?
I think, yeah, good question. I think it's dependent on, like, I mean, like, do people realistically call you by that nickname anymore?
Okay.
I think is the question, right? I mean, like, in other words, like, if there are still people in your life who do call you that, then yes. If, the people who, maybe somebody who you haven't seen in 20 years, and that's it, then I don't think you have to worry about it. But so you just use your best judgment on that. And and we also talk about location, right? If you let's say you live in New York, okay, but where in New York do you live? And not necessarily an address, but literally, like, but do you live in, what borough do you live in? What, I mean, things like that, where, again, it has to be, oh, it's like, oh, it's that John Smith who lives in Staten Island or what have you, right? I mean, that's, you're trying to make sure that you have the identity. So the divorcing husband has to provide that information. They also have to be the ones who provide the fee for the Mossad Gitin. Once the husband has done that, they are they no longer have to deal with the process. The get is written. And the Mossad Gitin has a couple of witnesses to make sure that the get is written appropriately. And then the get is then sent to somebody who is charged with the responsibility of delivering the get and to the woman. And that process, that ritual has to be also properly witnessed. And they literally send and I've been in a position where I've delivered a get to, and like I think two or three times to different women whose marriage was concluding. And they literally send you a script in which the person delivering the get says, okay, do you, are you so and so from so and so? Yes, I am. Were you married to so and so from so and so? Yes. Are you accepting this get with the you have to go through this whole script to make sure that no one's forcing anybody to do any of this. Like that all this is done out of free will and full decision, and full disclosure. So, and once that's done, the woman has to, like, extend her hands like this, and the get is placed there. She actually walks a couple of steps to show that she has received it and everything like that. So and once that is done, then the one who delivered the get alerts the Mossad Gitin that that process has completed. And once that's done, a certificate is then made up to both the former husband and the former wife to essentially say, you are now free to marry someone else. Um, in my case, obviously, there was a certain awkwardness in that I was, the rabbi of my synagogue. So, and the rabbi of, I mean, my ex-wife no longer belonged to the synagogue, but she was still in that community. So it would not have been, I don't think, it would have been appropriate for me to be the deliverer of the get. And, and I felt it was important to not it's a difficult moment. I didn't want to make the moment more difficult than it had to be. So there was at the time a retired rabbi who lived in Charleston that was kind enough to make the time, and he was the one who delivered the get. So I wasn't even there. And then I got a note saying that it was okay for me to potentially remarry one day. Um, there is so uh, and here's another thing that I would say is unfair, although this one I kind of understand the reason behind it, even though I don't really agree with it. Once the get has been delivered, the man could then remarry that afternoon. The woman has to wait 3 months. It's not fair.
Only
I
that afternoon?
if one wanted to, if he could convince somebody, I don't know. I mean, one could.
Why
Make
does
sure she's not pregnant.
Yeah, it has
Who
to
the
do with
father is.
yeah, it has to do with identity of yeah. To me, there's no reason why you can't wait why both people can't wait 3 months to my way of thinking. But
Well, I just remember him telling me, "You're free."
yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah. So it has to do with the identity of parentage. If there is if there is a pregnancy that takes place, from there.
so
So
if you're married to a non-Jewish spouse
yes,
who did not convert, do you still need to do a get?
I don't believe so.
Because it wasn't a Jewish wedding.
Right.
Right, okay. Now, what
Right.
if it was a non-Jewish spouse, but you actually did a Jewish wedding? Would that make a difference?
Um, with all due respect, we are not yet, at least I and other conservative rabbis are not yet in the position uh, to
To to
to
do that.
right to
Yeah.
say that a wedding, but that a wedding between a Jew and a non-Jew is officially a Jewish wedding.
Okay.
That's not to say, like, I mean, there may be Jewish elements in the said wedding, right? And that's fine. I mean, that's okay. But it's just a matter of it doesn't have that official designation, and so therefore you wouldn't have to have so that requirement would not come into play in terms of the end of said marriage. So so uh, obviously, and again, I may have talked about this a little bit. There is a time where there are occasions, unfortunately, where a man will refuse to do a get after the divorce takes place, after the civil divorce takes place, which I think is cruel. Um, Actually, in one of my former congregations, we dealt with a different, with sort of like the reverse situation where the, where the husband provided the information, the money, like he did everything he needed to do, and his ex-wife was like, why should I accept? Why should I receive it? That wasn't nice either. I mean, to me, it's not because and she was clearly doing it to try to as a way of hurting
That's spite.
her ex.
Hostage, basically, right?
Yeah, yeah. And now had she put it off indefinitely, and that I mean, he could, there would have been a way to work out some sort of annulment within but still, it's still it's not it's not kind. to do that. And the thankfully, in the case that I'm speaking of, the woman did eventually acquiesce and say, "All right, fine."
Well, I have a funny story. So I married a Jewish guy, and my uncle, my cousin, and rabbi, whatever he was in New York, insisted that I get a get, and then I went and married a non-Jew.
Okay, it happens. It happens. I mean, like look, there's a lot of we deal with a lot of different scenarios.
Didn't
Uh,
convert.
yeah, yeah, we deal with a lot of scenarios. Listen, the idea is that um, uh, it is important, regardless of the circumstance, to treat everybody with decency and respect.
You wanted to make sure all three of be good everywhere and this and that. And then I went and married the father of my kids who was not Jewish and was gonna convert and then changed his mind because he thought be hypocritical. But he let me have the bris for my son and everything else. So
Okay, okay, yeah. I mean, life takes turns we don't expect.
mhm.
Yeah, that's absolutely true.
Is it up
Um,
to the individual rabbi? What to hear marry a couple that one of them's not Jewish and one is?
a conservative rabbi is not at this moment technically allowed to do that.
Is that like union rules, or how does that work?
It is the rule of the rabbinical assembly. Yes.
Which means because it's like, and you have a polite word for it, but it's like if you're in a union, you have to go by the union rules then.
Yes, I mean, and there have been a handful of conservative rabbis who were a member of the rabbinical assembly who then did not who decided not to leave the rabbinical assembly because they felt strongly enough that they should uh, conduct interfaith weddings. There have been a handful of people where that's been the case. Um, I do hope, by the way, I hope that I'm speaking of these things sensitively. The last thing I'd want to do is, I mean, I hope I'm being reason, reasonable in all this. Um, so anyway, so yeah, those are things to note, and yeah, and again, in terms of divorce, obviously, it's something that it is kind of, in some ways, kind of amazing, really, that the Torah, years and years and years ago, recognized the possibility that a marriage may need to be dissolved for reasons other than having to do with one of the spouse's deaths. It does recognize a certain understanding of the human condition. Again, I'm not thrilled with all of the traditional rules having to do with it, but we still, try to deal with it in the most sensitive way. Mark, yes.
Yeah, a little back note. Many years ago, uh, when Rabbi Pharisee was still at Hesker Muna, we had brought up as a community about letting non-Jewish spouses be regular members of the synagogue.
Mhm.
And of course, I asked the question, well, because my wife not being Jewish, she could have become a member. And I said, would you have married me and my wife? You know, and of course he said no. And I said, well, the answer is no. How can they be a member? So that discussion has happened at Hesker Muna.
Sure,
Um,
sure.
and I understood completely why he said no, he wouldn't. And I mean, I accept that. I knew that when we got married. So I
Yeah,
think the discussion has been going.
yeah, and it continues. I mean, in general, I mean, it continues throughout the movement in the Jewish world. And I think honestly, we haven't seen the last, honestly, of it. I mean, we had there's still. I think if I were to guess, I would say in the next generation, I would probably within the next, it would not surprise me that within my lifetime, whatever that lifetime should be, that the ability to officiate interfaith weddings would be something that I would be able to do, that somebody would be able to do that, and it would be sanctioned as an option. I think we are getting there. The movement isn't there yet. So yeah.
I would add that, I don't know how you knew I was going to say something.
No, I mean, no, body language. I don't know.
I would add that it is not unlikely that at some point the possibility of non-Jewish spouses being considered members at Heskamuna will be revisited.
Yeah. And I'm open to that discussion.
It's some people have urged me to do that, and I have said I would be fully supportive of that. I'm not going to lead the charge on that. I think it might cause some division in the congregation, and I'm not anxious to cause division in the congregation right now, but if it comes from somewhere else, I'll certainly deal with it.
Sure. So we'll I think the discussion, frankly, is on, like, the overall discussion is ongoing, and should be.
The agreement, or could the potential spouses, before they're married, can they agree with each other that should the situation arise that both of them would agree to a get and have that put in the ketubah?
So that's what the Lieberman clause is.
Okay.
Yeah. So yes, the Lieberman clause is that agreement beforehand that, so it is in a sense kind of like a prenuptial agreement of sorts, not having to do with money, but having to do with
Binding.
it is considered binding. Yeah. Absolutely. Other questions regarding divorce. Okay. So I didn't mean to, I mean, like, again, the title of this. Yeah, no, I agree, Catherine. I mean, yeah, that Judaism must continue to evolve. I agree, and I think that's part of the foundation of what the synagogue stands for, what the conservative movement stands for. So, I didn't mean to put divorce and sickness in the same title, but when you're dealing with life cycle things, in terms of Jewish commentary on that, sickness often is kind of the next thing we talk about. I mean, we could technically skip over that, but then again, what if we did that? Then the title of this talk would be Divorce and Death, which I think would have been even more morbid. So I figured, all right, let's go to divorce and sickness. I'm not trying to link the two in terms of theme or anything like that.
One other question.
Oh yeah, sure, yeah.
Is there any thing in Jewish law regarding how a divorced couple manages their shared children?
Is there anything in Jewish law having to do with how a divorced couple needs to manage their children post-divorce? I don't think there's much. I can't think of much that would sort of be, kind of like an official stance. I think, you'd go back to sort of overall principles of, first of all, kivud av v'em, the one of the 10 Commandments, which is, to honor your father and mother, so that hopefully the child involved will continue to maintain a relationship with both parents. Sometimes that's easier said than done. But that is certainly an ideal to strive for, that continues to happen. And I think also, in terms of general, and that because of that, a hope that because that is a value that children should respect and have a relationship with their parents, that both parents therefore will make it possible for the kids to have relationships with both of them. That much I think I can say. But in terms of custody things, I don't think there's a blueprint per se. I could be wrong, but I don't think there's a blueprint. So Okay. Regarding sickness, we're against it. We would prefer that we not get sick. I say that I know I say that with a bit of tongue in cheek, but obviously, um, uh, maintenance of health is certainly a value. Certainly something that is important. We know, um, and I have mentioned this at when we were talking about Shabbat, but the preservation of a life, pikuach nefesh, supersedes almost every commandment that we have. In other words, if you need to break a commandment in order to save someone's life, you do it. The three exceptions are um, if someone points a gun to you and says you have to kill this person, you're not allowed to do that. If someone points a gun, points a gun and says that you have to do an immoral sexual activity, and the third one is if somebody threatens your life, saying that you have to commit idolatry. Those are the three times where um, you are supposed to uh, put your life at risk rather than doing any of those three things. Other than that, you can do what you need to do in order to preserve your life. To an extent, that also has to do with sickness, right? In other words, um, if it is going to threaten your health, and I recognize that there is a certain amount of vagueness of what it means to what preserves your health, right? There's a certain that can be kind of there's a wide range of what that can mean. But if you are putting if you know that you are putting your health in jeopardy, then there are certain times where you can supersede your where you can supersede other commandments. So I think one of the great recent examples is that of the COVID-19 pandemic, in which oftentimes, I felt that, the synagogue that I worked for, that I felt like the synagogue I worked for at the time was, I would say, very, very cautious, maybe more cautious than most, in terms of um, requiring not only masking, but also at different points in the pandemic, limits of how many people could be in the room, and also limits based on how much time we could congregate together, which became a major factor during the high holidays. Right, the high holiday services, from beginning to end, you're talking, for the morning service, you're talking usually about like 3.5 hours at least. I try to make it about 3.5 hours if I can, but sometimes there are factors beyond our control. Um, you know, and what we were told by the doctors in the congregation where I worked, was you got to you absolutely have to limit the amount of time that you're spending in the service, which meant making some challenging cuts to things. But it was all done with the idea of pikuach nefesh. We didn't want to spread the sickness more than it was already going to spread. We wanted to take preventative measures. Now, I recognize that throughout the pandemic, there was a certain amount of controversy of what what was appropriate, what was an appropriate precaution and what wasn't. And I recognize that some of those debates, bled into the political spectrum, and I'm not trying to make a judgment one way or the other on those things. But suffice it to say that when we were having those discussions, and boy, did we have a lot of discussions about these things. I mean, there were many, many hours spent dealing with how we deal with policies regarding the pandemic. We kept going back to, okay, of pikuach nefesh. Not unlike, of course, many, many groups of people who obviously, for whom obviously preserving one's health is considered a value. I mean, obviously, Judaism is far from alone in talking about the importance of health, etc. But we were always, because we have this value of pikuach nefesh, of saving one's life, of preserving health, then we were able to, couch that into Jewish values relatively directly. So, so for instance, a lesson that I heard, a lesson that I learned in this is when I was a kid, my mother was having a really hard time digestively dealing with Passover. A lot of people have challenges with digestion for Passover. She got sick. She got sick one particular year. Thankfully, there was something. Well, there was something particular going on with her health at that moment that just made Passover food just impossible. And one of those things is that one of the things that happens is that so it was recommended by her doctor that, like, okay, maybe you have to have some food that isn't necessarily kosher for Passover. So I remember, and we were young kids at the time, and we went to a Jewish school, so we were on our Passover break. So I remember one morning we went in the middle of Passover, we went to a diner, and because she didn't want to bring non-Passover food into her home, so we went out to a diner, and I remember her taking great pains to saying, listen, I know this is unusual, and if you don't want to have like toast or an English muffin right now, that's okay, but the reason why I'm having it is because of and explaining about the important preservation of health. If so there are times where we just need to do that. Catherine asks, conservative Judaism's stance on death with dignity. If it's okay, when we talk about specifically about death, if we could get to that, please feel free to bring it up again. So I wanted to talk about that. There are times where we do need to suspend certain rules because and I talk about this sometimes. There are values in conflict, right? There's the value of keeping, in this case, keeping Passover versus the value of preserving health. And sometimes the two don't match. And the answer is you go according to, you go according to your health. This is assuming, I should acknowledge, this is assuming that all other options are exhausted, right? In other words, you don't, I mean, to say, all right, I don't feel like it is not a reason to suspend observing Jewish rituals and law, because it's like, oh, it's a downer. Okay, maybe it is, but again, you have to be considerate of the matter of health. I will say though that, and I recognize that this may be a little amorphous at this point, but as our society in general, And I would think and hope that as Judaism in general becomes more sensitive to matters of mental health, that that has to be taken into consideration as well. It's something that, again, it's, you know, uh, sometimes matters of mental health are a little uh, less clear on how to diagnose and deal with certain matters than, let's say, what may be happening to us physically. But I would maintain that that mental health considerations are no less real than those of physical health. And so, uh, do I? So I can't speak to every implication of that, but I do want to acknowledge that. Um, I mean, I would say, and I feel like most Jewish authorities would say that in the same way that many people say, like, okay, I don't believe in, I don't believe in, I don't believe that people should be on medication for mental health things. If they have that, it's like, well, are you against medication if you break your leg? Are you against medication for hurting your arm? Like, in other words, like we have to respect the need to be treated. Um, uh, Again, we are still discovering and learning more about the mystery that is the human mind. But we should not ignore that as a factor. Um, the other thing that I wanted to touch on before the hour is up is the matter of visiting the sick. This is known as Bikur Cholim. Livaker, which is to visit, and cholim, meaning people who are sick. Chole is the Hebrew word for sick, um, uh, which I always find funny. It's always funny sometimes when people will say certain Hebrew phrases or certain Hebrew words and say it in a uh, kind of a like a Americanized way. So like every time, once in a while, I hear about people they say bicker cholim, which makes it sound like we're going to visit sick people and argue with them, like we're going to bicker with sick people. Okay, that's not what it is. Bikur cholim is the importance. Um, uh, it is considered a value, and according to some teachings from the Talmud, there are statements that if we visit the sick, that visiting the sick aids in a person's recovery. Now, it is there's no scientific proof of this necessarily. I mean, but to to visit, does it certainly help in many cases the spirit of those who are facing illness? In many cases, it does. You have to do it with care, obviously. The And I would say this was easier in terms of people being able to visit those who were, let's say, hospitalized. It was easier before the different HIPAA regulations. I'm not saying that to criticize the HIPAA regulations. And when HIPAA, what I'm talking about are basically privacy regulations for those who are sick. In other words, the idea that if you're sick, you have a right to privacy. In other words, if you don't want people knowing about your illness, you have rights to limit that knowledge. So it used to be that a rabbi could call up a hospital and say, hey, so who are your Jewish patients and where are they? And they'd have a list. You're not really supposed to do that now. Like they're not supposed to tell you, who they are. Hospitals often have chaplains who will, ask, can your faith be a matter of our records? So then we can, would you like us to contact a rabbi? Would you like us, or whatever faith they may be? Are you, would you like us to contact your faith leader? You have to ask, though. You have to make sure. And by the way, and important to know that these are HIPAA. That's the acronym. One time, somebody wrote in a synagogue bulletin, "Please be sensitive to the hippo regulations." And no, we are not dealing with actually hippopotami. If there's a hippopotamus that's sick, I'll leave it to the veterinarians. But in all seriousness, so there's a general understanding within a synagogue community that the rabbi, the leadership of a congregation doesn't necessarily know unless somebody tells them, unless that person has clearance to note that. In other words, we have to be aware that, like, and there are times where people will tell me, look, this person said it was okay to tell you, Rabbi, but they don't want that out there. They don't want that information out there. I have to respect that. Okay. Will, you have a question?
Yeah, it's not exactly related, but it's related to the topic before we get going. In the synagogue I was previously a member of, during COVID, the board members had to all start learning to use Zoom. That's where I learned, not by choice, but I had to learn to use Zoom because we started meeting the way. And somewhere along during that period, I can't remember if they gave us a reason or did they said, okay, we can now start having services and count people over Zoom as part of the menu. And since it's an independent congregation, I don't know if that was just something they did or was that something that was universal, that how they want to say you can be counted in Zoom as being present for a minion.
So we do count people over Zoom in making a minion. I would say it is a relatively liberal interpretation of it. I feel like that, however, has enabled people who are homebound, who are out of town, who may be dealing with the sickness themselves, to still be able to participate in some way and still be able to be a part of the congregation itself.
But how
Not
did that happen? Was it like somewhere they discussed this, or just the individual congregations or rabbis figured that out on their own?
Individual congregations, made that decision. There were some conversations within the conservative movement law committee that considered that question. In general, that was not that that was considered to be a little too um, liberal for a lot of rabbis' tastes, but not everybody. So not everybody allowed quite that much. When I was, I spent most of the pandemic working for a synagogue in Buffalo, New York, and the rule we went on was that unless you actually had 10 people physically in one room, we did not we did not count it as a minion, except if you had 10 people at least on Zoom, then we allowed ourselves to do one mourner's Kaddish at the end, because the thought was that was the merciful thing to do for so many people who desperately wanted to be able to say Kaddish, desperately wanted to remember a loved one and to remember them through that ritual. They said, okay, well, we're not going to do a full service, but we're going to allow that. So that was a decision made by that community, actually by the rabbi who was there at the very beginning of the pandemic. That was a decision that I actually inherited when I came there. So yes, different people, went about it different ways. Yeah.
I wasn't involved in the decisions, but I know during at least the beginning of COVID, for the high holidays, we had services on Zoom, or it was actually streaming, which I don't know that's a difference that escapes me, but that's okay. We were streaming, and we had 10 people at all times in the sanctuary, but no one else was, and they were required to be like in different parts of the sanctuary, and no one else was allowed to be in the sanctuary. So that's, I guess we were more cautious than your prior congregation as far as that went. A second thing is I just wanted to let people know, if they don't, that Heskamuna does have a Bikor Holim committee that cooks and takes meals to people and does other things in service of people with sickness. I've heard recently of the story of somebody doing shopping for a couple who needed that done. So Sandy Parker is the chair of that committee. I'm just saying.
Yeah, no, 100%. And listen, when it comes to one thing I should mention before, I mean, we just got a couple more minutes, but one thing I want to make sure to mention is when one visits someone who is sick, there are a couple things to keep in mind. One is to, in general, unless the sick person specifically asks you, to keep the visit relatively short. Because oftentimes, beyond whatever sickness they have, they're tired. They're really tired. So so don't feel like you have to go in and like entertain somebody for hours, right? I mean, just to like, well, I'll let you, I'll let after 5-10 minutes, or I'll let you rest, but just wanted to extend that. And also I'll close with this little interesting tip that one of my teachers taught me when he was a congregational rabbi, was that he would visit people, like, so when he would visit somebody in a hospital. Let's say this person was located on the 5th floor of the hospital. He would take the elevator to the 4th floor and then walk up a flight of stairs to the 5th floor. And the reason why, it reminded him of the blessing that he, at that moment, at the very least, was well enough to, to be able to use his body to full capacity, and as a way to humble oneself, to recognize, okay, the person I'm going to visit, at least at this moment, does not have that privilege. And so uh, we need to be sensitive to those things. So that was something that worked for him in terms of focusing his mind and his heart toward that. It's not like you have to do that, but it was just but I liked that lesson, that reminder that when we visit somebody who's sick, usually we have been blessed, at least at that moment, with reasonable health, and we are there to comfort, console, bring and bring just a sense of bring kindness to those who are dealing with their illness. So at this point, let me just let you go, and we are I figured that we're going to talk about viewpoints and practices having to do with death and mourning, probably over the course of the next two sessions, because there's a lot to talk about, a lot of rituals to mention, and obviously, some of the emotions and approaches that we take. So I will look forward to seeing you in this space next week over Zoom.
Have a safe trip home, Rabbi.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Thanks so
safe
much.
trip.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.